Friends, welcome. It's good to have all of you here. Good afternoon for some, good morning to others. And again, great to have everybody here at this Death Penalty 101 webinar. So my name is Sam Heath, and I work with Equal Justice USA, and we're a national nonprofit, and we do work around death penalty repeal, restorative justice, and community safety. And this is a webinar that we've called Death Penalty 101. And our hope with this is to give a low barrier intro into the history of the death penalty, what's happening with things now, and where and what can you do to follow up and start to engage with things more and more. So thank you for coming. Thanks to each person who's here, and also keep in mind there's hundreds of people who've come here from all over the country. So thanks for coming. So I first want to thank, I had this up a second ago, all of our co-sponsors for helping spread the word about this time and share this with others. So Equal Justice USA, of course, is helping with this, as well as some others. Flock, which is the Faith Leaders of Color Coalition, the Eighth Amendment Project, Bend the Arc Jewish Action California, Clemency California, CCDA, which is the Christian Community Development Association, and Witness to Innocence. So thanks to all of those co-sponsors for supporting this, getting the word out to others. We appreciate you very much. You're going to hear a lot of things that are interesting. I think you're also going to hear some things that are challenging in a lot of ways. And I'll say a little more on this later, but the posture I'm hoping that we can come into this space with is something that I heard from a counselor many, many years ago, and she spoke about it applying to relationships, but it's great really in any kind of context where there's a community. She talked about being curious, not furious. It's something that's smart and hard. I especially think about it as a parent, but I'm hoping we can approach all that we hear in this space with that posture of first being curious. Having a righteous indignation or anger is a good thing. So it's not saying there's no place for that emotion, but I'm hoping we can be curious about what we hear in this space. I'm going to ask you all to engage the chat with a few things down there, and I'll put this in there. If you don't mind, would love to hear where you are located, state and city, if you're willing to share that, as well as, and if you can put this all in the same chat, if you're willing to share why you are here, what brought you into this space. We'll talk about this as well. So many of the facts are really important when we think about the death penalty, but I'm also really curious about what drew you into this space. What was it that you read or that you're curious about that pulled you into this afternoon or late morning where you took some time out of your schedule to hear what's going on here? So as those fall into the chat, take a look at those. It's great to hear people's reasons why they're here. I also love seeing that there are a lot of people from all over here. While those fall down in the chat, I'm going to point us to the first thing that we'll look at and listen to. Witness to Innocence is one of the co-sponsoring organizations, and they have a project called Moving Portraits that the photographer Martin Scholler helped do pretty recently. And a lot of these are really, really short, and you can see me scrolling down. There's a lot of options of different individuals that you can hear from. But these are individuals who were on death row and have since come off of death row to tell their story about their innocence and how and why they were put mistakenly on death row. And they travel the country sharing their stories. And here's a very short piece from a woman named Sabrina Butler Smith. You can see down there, she spent 5 years in prison, as well as 3 years on death row for a crime she did not commit. There's a lot of these stories. I'll send you this link later on and hope you can explore this, but I want you to hear just briefly from Sabrina before we continue on.
I was 19 years old when I made it to death row. I had never been incarcerated before, so I didn't know what to expect. When they take you in, they have you strip you of everything that you thought was yours. It's not yours anymore. On my name tag, it had capital murder. That was humiliating. But the walk to maximum security was, hard for me because the officer that walked beside me told me that he said, you see those inmates out there in the field? He said, we tell them when to go to sleep, when to get up, what to eat. You will die here. And when he said that to me, I didn't know what to do. All I could do was cry because, hear somebody telling you that you're going to die. What would you do if someone say that to you? Your life is not your own anymore. You're a ward of the state, and whatever they say, that's what goes.
Again, there are a lot of stories that are there, and I'm hoping you can engage those. Anything that I show on the screen or any link or website or group that I mention, keep in mind, I'm going to put all of those in some show notes in a Google Doc and make sure to get those to you. Uh, Anybody who's registered for this will send you a recording on YouTube of this webinar, and in the description will be a link to a Google Doc. And all of these links, all the co-sponsors, anything that we talk about and show here will be in that space, so you can make sure to take a look at all of those. I want to also start with another story. That was a brief bit from Sabrina, but I also want to begin with another story from an individual named Tremaine Wood. And so he's on death row in Oklahoma. And I want to share a bit about his story. And what I want to land on with this is some of the things that I'm going to mention with Tremaine and his story might sound atypical and upsetting and egregious that they can happen in the criminal legal system. But when we look at the death penalty and many who are on death row, a lot of these things end up being typical. So, for a little over 19 years, Tremaine has been on death row within Oklahoma since he was convicted in 2004. He and his brother participated in a robbery that ended with a murder, and his brother admitted to being the individual who shot the other person that resulted in that person's death. There's a lot that we could say about this case, and I'll send you Tremaine's site so you can see a lot that's there. But there are a couple things to really think about and consider with this. I'm also going to pull up, wanting you to be able to see some photos of Tremaine as we're talking about and sharing this. So Tremaine is an individual who's been there, as I said, for almost 2 decades. He's been there. There have been a couple problems with his case, as we've talked about that. I think I might have taken off the photo. There was racial bias within his trial. Everybody who was on the jury during his capital litigation trial were individuals who were white, minus one person who was a Black woman who has since recanted her vote and been very vocal about why she pulled back from that guilty verdict and that death verdict that she gave. We also could talk about some issues that happened within the trial. The lawyer who was chosen to represent Tremaine was struggling with both alcohol and drug addiction while he was representing Tremaine and many, many others. And he himself has been open about that. He billed very shockingly few hours for Tremaine's case. And so a lot of things that were important for the jury to hear, they did not. One of those was Tremaine's background and all of the abuse that he experienced as a child. And it wasn't something that the jury was privy to. And it's not something that excuses any participation or in the crime or action that he had, but it helps explain a lot of the things that brought him to that place. The jury was not given the ability to be able to hear that. Another thing that was key is that the jury did not hear that Tremaine's brother had admitted to committing that crime. So a lot of information has come in about this as we've learned about Tremaine's case. Things that would have helped the jury to know, might have changed what they had voted on or what vote they had given there. And again, I want to make us think through that this sounds upsetting, it's bothersome, or I'm hoping that it is, but a lot of these things aren't atypical. A lot of the individuals on death row share very, very similar backgrounds as we look at childhood, as we look at abuse, as we look at their trial process and some of the issues and problems that came in there. And so Tremaine is one of many stories that we could talk about and share as we think about the death penalty. And so I wanted to begin with that to set the table by really centering his story. Here's some other things that we can keep in mind as we come into this space. I started earlier by saying, and I want to repeat that here, that it's great to be curious, not furious. Again, maybe I should say not only furious, or it's an order of things. And I'm hoping we can approach a lot that we hear today with curiosity, with wonder, with questioning, with maybe wanting to learn more. Also want to say that it's something that in this space we can disagree on an issue, and that's great and that's right and good, but we can't dismiss someone's experience. Already you've heard a couple stories of individuals' experiences, and I'm going to point you to a lot of other stories so you can hear from and about these individuals as well. I also want to say, and this is part of why I asked in the chat for you to share what brought you into this space, that this time together isn't only about what you believe, but I really want us to think through how you came to believe it. If we were in a smaller group or a one-on-one conversation, it's always fascinating to hear people's stories of how they came to believe something. It's almost always more interesting than what it is that they actually believe, but that pathway of how they came to that belief. And I'm hoping that you can think back over your life and think of where you are now when you think about the death penalty and what brought you to that place or that space. Again, each claim that I'm going to make, I'm going to work to have in the show notes so that you can go back and research those, read a lot more detail. And also want to say, if anybody has any questions, I don't think we'll have time for a Q&A at the end, but I really want to register your questions. There may be some kind of follow-up webinar, another event that we might do, but I at least want to see what questions have struck you. And so if you can put those in the Q&A feature and not in the chat. A lot's happening in the chat. Again, there's hundreds of people here, and I can't quite keep up with that in real time. But if you put that in the Q&A feature, you can click on that at the bottom of your screen. You can put those in there. I'll try to come at some of those while we're speaking. But again, at minimum, I really want to be able to register those. Right now, as we begin starting to look at the history of the death penalty and where things are now, I'm going to turn to a colleague and friend. So Sarah Kraft is here, and she's the death penalty director at Equal Justice USA. And I'm going to turn things over to her so that she is able to share some of what is the current state of things around the death penalty.
Thank you so much, Sam. Appreciate being here. And thanks to everyone who's participating. I love seeing all of those chats and where people are from and lots of familiar names. So I am going to do a really short presentation to help folks understand where we are with the death penalty in the United States right now. Hoping you can see my screen. And yeah, it's just a brief introduction of where the death penalty is and how it's on the decline in the United States. I'm a map person, so the first thing I'm going to show you is this map. So currently there are 27 states that have the death penalty. And in addition to that, there is a separate death penalty for the federal government at the national level and also another one for the US military. So the states that are in blue here represent those that have ended the death penalty, including the 11 that have ended it in what we call the modern era. The modern era is between 1976 and now. And in 1976 is when the US Supreme Court approved state death penalty laws after they had previously ruled that the death penalty laws were written and administered in an arbitrary and capricious fashion. So that's what we consider the modern era, is everything after 1976. So in addition to the 23 states that do not have the death penalty, there are 3 states, Oregon, California, and Pennsylvania, that have governors who have said there will be no executions while I'm in office. And that's what we call a moratorium on executions. The Biden administration has also officially instituted a moratorium on executions at the federal level. Then in addition to that, we have Ohio, Tennessee, and Arizona who have paused executions because of initiated by their governor, have paused to look at some element of the death penalty. So those are all of those yellow gold states. And in those 7 jurisdictions, including the federal government, that represents over half of the death row population in the United States. So half of those who are currently on death row live in a place or are in a place where they are not having executions. So in addition to the states with no death penalty and those who have officially paused executions, there are 16 states that have not carried out an execution in the last 5 years. So you can see now on our map that there are a lot of places around the country where the death penalty is just not a part of the current reality. In fact, 13 states, all of those that are in the darker purple, plus California, Pennsylvania, and Oregon, haven't had an execution in more than 10 years. So as you can see, it's a very different map than the first one we saw, and it really shows how isolated the death penalty is around the country. So when we think about the current reality of the death penalty in the United States, we think about these maps and how isolated executions and death sentences, how isolated executions are. We also look at the number of death sentences handed out each year. It's another metric of how the death penalty is dying. You can see that the 21 death sentences in 2023 were 93% below the peak of 315 in 1996. So fewer and fewer prosecutors are seeking the death penalty, and fewer juries are giving the death penalty in cases. In addition to death sentences, we look at the number of executions per year. Execution numbers are also lower than they've been in over 30 years. 2023's executions were 76% lower than at their peak in 1999. And finally, and this is the last slide I'll show, another metric we look at to assess the current state of the death penalty is public opinion. Overall support for capital punishment remains at a 5-decade low in the United States. In 2023, last October, the Gallup survey found that 53% of Americans favor the death penalty, which is the lowest since March of 1972. And results from 2019 indicate that support for the death penalty drops even lower to 36% when respondents are given the option of life without parole. When Gallup first asked about the death penalty in 1936, 59% of Americans supported the death penalty for convicted murders. And public support for the death penalty peaked in 1994 with 80% of Americans favoring it, but that has steadily declined since that year. So I'm going to stop sharing and thank you all for letting me do a really brief presentation. It's really great to be here with you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Sam, who's going to talk a little bit more about the history of the death penalty.
Thanks, Sarah, very much. For the history of the death penalty, there's so much that we could share, and I'll put this in the show notes. And Death Penalty Information Center, or DPIC, is an organization that has chronicled so much about the death penalty and also looking back throughout history. And so there are just a few things that we'll pull in from the death penalty. If we go back to the beginning of this country, and if we start counting individuals that we've executed in a public way, the count is at about 16,000 people. Now, if we're talking about the modern era of the death penalty, just like Sarah spoke of, we're with Alan Miller, assuming the executions that are lined up happen through the end of September. Alan Miller in Alabama, who his execution date is September 26th, he will be the 1600th execution in the modern era of the death penalty. And one more thing, just to get a sense of some of the numbers, there's just about 2,200 individuals that are on death row right now. So what I want to turn to, and I'll put this in the chat so you can see it, but we'll talk through this, is there are a lot of different arguments in favor of and against the death penalty, but I think you could collapse a lot of them into about 6 different arguments that come up. Many of my conversations get passionate and deep and go a lot of different places. And a lot of my conversations with people about the death penalty often end with someone saying, Sam, that's the longest conversation I've ever had about the death penalty. And I think that might be true for most of us. I know it was true for me up until not too many years ago that I hadn't thought very much about the death penalty. But when I had, I thought in terms of some of these arguments. But you can see there in the chat, and if not, I'm going to read through and talk through these. There's about 6 common arguments that come up around the death penalty. And you can phrase these as for or against. I'm going to phrase them in such a way that there are 6 arguments in support of the death penalty. And we'll talk about each of these. That'll be the bulk of the remainder of our time here. So the 6 arguments, the first one is that it's fair. And there are a few ways we can measure whether or not it's fair. We'll talk about race. We'll talk about vulnerability of who it is that's being executed, and we'll talk about inaccuracy. We'll also talk about arbitrariness from a geographic sense. Another argument that comes up often is that it's fiscally responsible, that if we execute those individuals, it's far cheaper than keeping them alive every day for the rest of their life. A third is that it serves murder victims' family members and their broader families, that it brings them a sense of justice. Often you'll hear this with prosecutors, with DAs, that will talk about working for governors as well, working for and trying to achieve justice for those victims. That comes up a lot. Another is that it deters crime, that it has a measurable impact on ways that we're measuring crime across the nation or in different cities or states. A fifth one is that the death penalty is safe and that it's quick, both from the perspective of it's something that once that person receives the death sentence, it quickly happens, and also from the perspective of when that person's execution starts, it happens quickly. We'll talk about all of that. And then the sixth one, there are a lot of ways to phrase this, but I put down it's okay with God. We could have put just that it's okay with religion, but I specifically wanted to mention God, and we'll have a special focus on Christianity, and I'll talk about why that is and why that's really important that we single out talking about Christianity within this as well. So I want to talk through those six pieces about how and why all of those relate. And so let's first talk about this idea that it's fair. So first, we'll think about that from the perspective of whether or not the death penalty is applied in a fair manner with regard to race. Well, we know that the death penalty is applied in an egregiously I've used that word a lot already because it applies, a largely racially discriminatory manner. And so we know that the death penalty is racist both in its origin. There's a very clear historical thread connecting the history of lynching to the death penalty, and we know that the death penalty is racist in its application for those individuals that are being executed and for a certain focus on a certain kind of victim that is singled out over other kinds of victims. We'll look at that as well. Some of you have mentioned this in the chat, but a lot of the states with the highest number of lynchings historically still have the highest number of executions. Also talked about that direct connection to lynching. We have on record several southern states, governors from those states saying publicly that they needed the death penalty so that they would be able to replace lynching, since lynching was no longer publicly acceptable. It was eventually something that was illegal. So there's an attorney who talked about this he's quoted in a book called The Biblical Truth About America's Death Penalty. And I'll put that quote in the chat if it helps you to see it as I read through it. But he speaks about this. He says, the legal system is the institution in our society that has been least affected by the civil rights movement. The judges are white, the prosecutors are white, the lawyers are white, and even in communities with substantial African American populations, the jury may be all white. In many cases, the only person of color who sits in front to face the bar in the courtroom is the person on trial. The death penalty remains, as it always has been throughout our history, a matter of race. And we know that this is true. It's a very measurable thing of how the death penalty is applied and its connection historically to things like lynching. Keep in mind just one factor, one statistic. About 13% of the population in the United States is Black, but yet 53% of exonerations and 34% of executions are individuals who are Black. So there's a disproportionate way already that we know, it's measurable, of how the death penalty has been applied. Innocent Black Americans, we also know, are 7 times more likely to be falsely convicted of violent crimes than white Americans. So again, if we look at just the conviction piece before we even get to a death sentence, we see some disproportionality there as well. I'll send you one article from a colleague who's written about this connection of lethal injection to Nazi Germany. In fact, its origins, the origins of lethal injection with Nazi Germany. There's 5 execution methods we'll talk about here, and the one that's used the most often now is lethal injection. But it's important to remember the origins of where that came from. And again, if we're talking about matters of race, that's something that's right there beside Nazi Germany and its history. Exonerations of people who are Black are 50% more likely to include misconduct by police than white exonerations. So at any point we look at this story, if we're looking at investigation, if we're looking at the trial, if we're looking at conviction, if we're looking at the death sentence, we see a disproportionate amount of people of color, particularly those who are Black, affected by this. I want to show you as well some slides that came from the Death Penalty Policy Project. I want to thank them for sharing these with us and letting us talk about some of these things. And give me one moment to pull these up. And what I want to talk about and try to show visually, because I think it will be really helpful to see this, is that connection to lynching and how that has gone throughout history. So you can see here, this is a picture of a lynching that's about to occur. It's in the state of Texas. It's in 1893. You see, or it's kind of hard to see, but excuse me, let me back up. This is the first one, 1893 in the state of Texas. It's hard to see, but there's other photos and records, so we know and can say this. It's a person who is Black, surrounded by an audience that is almost exclusively white. Fast forward to the second photo, 1936, in the state of Kentucky, and this is a public and legally sanctioned execution. Again, an individual that is Black, surrounded by a largely white audience. And just visually, as we look at and compare these two, and we look at these stories, you see an overlap of both those that are attending these executions, of those individuals that are being executed. And I'm not just pulling out these two. If you look at this thread, you can see a consistent story of how the death penalty has been applied, how it was used within the history of lynching, and how a lot of the death penalty came up as a replacement for that. You can also see here this graphic showing on the left lynching of Black victims. You can see right around where they're congregated from 1883 until 1940, largely concentrated in the South and the states that were in the Confederacy. And then you can see there on the right executions of Black defendants from 1972 up through 2020. And if you kept going through now, 2024, it would just be even more concentrated. But you see an overlap of those. We'll talk later. I saw somebody in the chat already mention that the Bible Belt in the United States is another area that overlaps with a lot of this, and there's reasons for that as well. Here you can see a graphic that's capturing U.S. executions by race of the defendant. And you can see those that are white, and then you can see those that are Black. And what I want to highlight here is the disproportionate amount, particularly of those that are Black that have been executed. If you look at that alongside this, here are U.S. executions that are happening by race of the victim. You can see overwhelmingly that people who have been executed are largely executed for murdering someone or being accused of murdering someone who is white. And so we have, again, a huge disproportionality within how the death penalty is applied, and that the number one predictor of whether or not somebody receives a death sentence is the race of the victim, meaning whether or not that person is white. You can see those two side by side each other as well. So keep in mind when we talk about race, there's a lot to consider. There's a lot of history with that over the United States. And there are a lot of places that we could go with that. And I'll send you a little more info as we talk about this over time. So another piece as we talk about the death penalty and whether or not it's fair is thinking about that often it's the most vulnerable who are executed. And so we know that the death penalty isn't fair in the way that it's applied because we see who it's applied to, not just disproportionately to people of color, but often to individuals struggling with mental illness, individuals with brain injuries, with a developmental brain damage, with a lower IQ that even goes into the range of intellectual disability. We know many individuals have had chronic or serious childhood traumas, neglect, abuse, all of those individuals. It's very difficult to find someone on death row who does not have an incredibly similar and overlapping childhood, especially when we look at abuse. Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative has been quoted as saying, "We have a system of justice that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent." So there's also that piece as well. It will be very difficult to find someone who on death row who is a wealthy individual. So we know that we're executing disproportionately based on race. We know that we are executing the most vulnerable within our population. And we know that we are executing those that are most impoverished and they're connected to their families. Keep in mind, we also still execute individuals for acts that they committed when they were teenagers, because 19 still counts as that. Now, we talk about, and this came up in some of the discussion already in the chat as well, we can talk about, we know we execute the innocent. We can talk about the inaccuracy. Many will talk about that the death penalty is wrong at any point, whether the person is guilty or not. But it's important also to recognize not only are we executing individuals that we, as best we can, know that have murdered other individuals, we know that we're executing the innocent. Very recently, the 200th individual who was wrongly convicted, that marker was reached. So since 1973, put another way, 200 individuals have been exonerated and we know have been wrongfully convicted with the death penalty. Witness to Innocence recently highlighted that, and I'll make sure you have the link to read about that. So it's been at least 200 people that we know of in this modern era of the death penalty that were nearly executed, that we found out later were innocent. Put another way, we know that for every 8 people who are executed, 1 person is exonerated. So we know that we've executed innocent individuals. Just one example is the case of Julius Jones, who was on death row for many, many years also in Oklahoma, where Tremaine Wood is as well. And Julius Jones, a few years ago, came within 4 hours of being executed. And yet you will have many witnesses and individuals, including Julius himself, talking about where he was at the time of this murder and all sorts of other evidence that relates to this case, and that many believe in are working for Julius Jones and saying that he's innocent. But 4 hours was as close that he got to. Another piece when we talk about whether or not the death penalty is fair is that it's arbitrary. And what I mean by that is that the death penalty is often applied in an arbitrary way, and it's not applied equally. It just depends, in a sense, where you live, whether or not a death sentence will be applied. If you look at maps, and the Death Penalty Information Center has a lot of these, and they're helpful to see, it's really about a handful of counties within the United States that are responsible for the majority of the death sentences within this country. And if you happen to commit your crime within those areas, it's more likely that you will receive a death sentence. Whereas if you're in another area and commit your crime there, it's very unlikely that you won't, or that you will receive a death sentence. So there's a geographic arbitrariness to it. Or put it this way, less than 2% of counties in the US account for more than half the nation's death row population and half of executions. More than 4/5 of the United States, 3,100 plus counties, have no one on death row. So we're looking at very concentrated geographic places that are often driven by individual judges and individual district attorneys that are looking at and working towards specific sentences and convictions for individuals to get them on to death row. Another piece that we'll talk about is whether or not the death penalty is fiscally responsible. Many people will say that it makes sense to execute these individuals because it saves money. And this is something that can be engaged and dealt with pretty quickly. We know that that's not true. Depending on the state, it costs about $40,000 or so a year to keep a person alive within prison. And there's a case study in Texas. There's other studies that have been shown that when you have someone go through a death penalty trial, everything changes. It's a special jury. You have experts that come in, and it's hundreds of thousands of dollars more to have that person go through a capital case than it is for a regular trial. And then that person is put on death row with extra security. And then if that person is executed, to pay for everything around that, as well as usually the drugs for lethal injection for that to happen, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars for that individual. And so we know, if we're looking at this just fiscally, that it doesn't make sense. It is very much fiscally irresponsible. It's not a great measure because it's not a very humanizing thing to talk about this in terms of money, but that often comes up, and we've got to keep in mind that it is far more expensive to execute someone than it is to keep that person alive. Another argument that comes up is that it serves victims and their families, or murder victim family members. There are incredible organizations like Journey of Hope, and I'll send you the link for them, that have started to chronicle, pull together, and elevate the stories of murder victim family members who, either before someone is executed who murdered a family member, start to say, we don't want this to happen, or after it's happened, they say, this has not brought the healing that we've wanted. Throughout the 1990s, the dominant narrative was that justice was achieved for murder victim family members when someone was executed. And then moving into times more recently, we've seen that narrative start to shift because more individuals and their stories have been elevated, so that we are hearing, which is what is actually true, many don't want individuals to be executed for crimes that they've done. And when that does happen, often those families share, this has not brought the healing that we expected. It's a long process to go through the death penalty. We'll say more about this, but there's a lot of prolonged pain for the murder victim family members, as it takes often decades to move toward an execution. With the court going through, often repeat trials and hearings, those individuals are called forth or forward or are witnessing this and re-traumatized. And again, it's often decades that someone's spending on death row. So it's prolonging so much of this pain for individuals and for their families. And when that execution happens, very often they say, this did not provide the healing that I thought it would. Just one example, in 2020 in Colorado, about 7 family members of murder victims came together and signed a letter that they sent to lawmakers asking them to pass a bill to end the death penalty there. And they said, quoting them here, our direct experiences with the criminal justice system and our struggles with grief have led us all to the same conclusion. Colorado's death penalty fails victims' families. And that narrative is coming up often and more as we hear more from murder victims' family members. Another argument, the fourth one, is that the death penalty, or knowing that the death penalty is there as an option, deters crime. This is something, again, sort of like the fiscally responsible piece, that's pretty easy to address. Again, thanks to the Death Penalty Policy Project, I'll send you all of these links here. But we know that the death penalty does not contribute to public safety. And there's no proof that exists that the death penalty actually deters crime. And there are all sorts of deterrent myths that are out there that are easily debunked. We know that the death penalty really, it's ultimately a distraction to what true and effective responses to violence are. I'll give just a nod to this, but when we talk about what is it that actually ends violence, or what is it that heals it, or what is it that responds to it and breaks that cycle, we know that the death penalty is not having an effect on that. There's so much that we could talk about, and we'll look at a little bit of this later, but there are all kinds of ways of things that we know have an effect on breaking the cycle of violence. We could talk about restorative justice. We could talk about hospital violence intervention programs. We could talk about violence interruption, or all sorts of community violence interruption models that are not just ideas or dreams, but we see working all across the country and all across the world, and we know have an impact on both preventing violence, crime, and harm, and also helping individuals recover from the trauma of those. A fifth piece or argument that comes up is that the death penalty is safe and quick. I've referenced this a little bit, but one way to talk about this is thinking about the time on death row. So from when someone gets convicted of that crime, is put on death row until the day that that person is executed. The average time on death row right now is about 20 years. Which is a period of time that's been recognized by international human rights bodies as constituting, quote, excessive and inhuman punishment, which we know is in violation of U.S. human rights obligations. So we're talking in terms of decades. If you go to the Death Penalty Information Center and see the executions of this year, any year, and see the length of time that those individuals have been on death row or length of time since conviction, we're speaking in terms of decades that those individuals have been there. Another way that we could talk about whether or not this is safe and quick is thinking about the actual time it takes to accomplish an execution. So from when that individual, it's beginning where they try to execute that person through the pronouncement of death. First, let's just say the execution methods within the United States. We know that there's lethal injection. This is the one that's used most often. There's gas, there's hanging, there's electrocution, and there's firing squad. So those 27 states that Sarah talked about that are still able to practice the death penalty, they don't practice all 5 of those, but gathering together all 27 of those states, those 5 methods apply to at least some of those states. Lethal injection, again, being the one that comes up the most often. But we know that there are a lot of both botched and failed executions that happen. Believe it was 2023 that the Death Penalty Information Center called the year of the botched execution. So a failed execution is an execution where they try to execute someone and they are unable to do it. Maybe they weren't able to find a vein for lethal injection and they have to stop the process, send that person back to death row, and potentially try again. A botched execution is one where things go horribly wrong within that process. And we know that that happens often. If you look at the description of executions that come up, last year, there were 24 executions that happened in the year 2023, and many of those individuals have horrifying and gruesome stories of how those things happen. I'll highlight just one story This past January in Alabama, an individual named Kenny Smith was executed. And this was significant in a lot of ways. One, Kenny was executed through a method called nitrogen hypoxia, which can fall under the gas piece. But it was the first time ever that nitrogen hypoxia, or putting a mask on someone and forcing nitrogen into their body until they suffocate, that had never been tried before, not just anywhere in the United States, but anywhere within the world. And it's a pretty horrifying story of how it came about that individuals thought about this and whether or not they should try it. Several states have that as a possibility that they could use, but Alabama so far is the only state and the only place in the world that has done that. But if you look at the accounts of those individuals who were in the room watching when Kenny was executed, both journalists as well as Kenny's wife, his spiritual advisor, describe the horrible, awful process of what happened to him in his body. And you can look at those accounts and hear how harrowing it was for them to watch and witness that. But the piece that we want to make sure we hear is that the state of Alabama came out after this execution and said this was a textbook, quote, textbook execution. And it's something that other states are looking at to do. Alabama itself has, I believe right now, 2 more executions scheduled this year. Both, there's more than that, but 2 of them are going to be, unless they're stopped with nitrogen hypoxia. The last argument that we'll look at and talk through is that the death penalty is okay with God. There's so much that we could say here, and I'll send you links that show many, many different faiths throughout the world have spoken out and against the death penalty in all sorts of ways. But let's look at a few key places, and especially looking at Christianity. I remember hearing from Shane Claiborne, who's an author and activist, and he said something to the effect of, if tomorrow morning, every evangelical Christian in the United States woke up and was against the death penalty, by that evening, it would be over. And that's true. The death penalty is so strongly supported by especially evangelical Christians that that's a huge group that's helping it continue and stay supported. One role that I have at EJUSA is I'm privileged to help manage our evangelical network. So a lot of my conversations and work is specifically with evangelical Christians. A few years ago, I had the privilege to meet Sister Helen Prejean of Dead Man Walking fame and longtime proponent of working against the death penalty. She knew Equal Justice USA and she knew the evangelical network, but she didn't know me specifically. I went up to her and I introduced myself to her and I said, Sister Helen, it's great to meet you. My name is Sam Heath. I'm with the EJUSA Evangelical Network. And she grabs my hand and she says, Sam, the evangelicals, they're the key to the whole thing, which was a jarring moment. And I might broaden her statement just to Christians as a whole. And I think she's right that the death penalty within this country is so supported, especially by evangelical Christians. It's certainly not the only group that we need to engage within looking at different religions or faiths, but it is by far overwhelmingly the largest group that is supporting it. So that's one reason why in some of what we're saying, we're focusing on Christianity as well. Well, I said earlier that 80% of executions still continue to happen within the Bible Belt. But there's groups that have spoken out about this. One group called the National Association of Evangelicals used to be for the death penalty and currently has a statement of neutrality on the death penalty. But I'll put this in the chat so that you can see, even in that neutral statement from this organization working with and working to represent many evangelical Christians, they will note all sorts of concerns about the death penalty: eyewitness error, coerced confessions, prosecutorial misconduct, racial disparities, incompetent counsel, inadequate instruction to juries, judges who override juries that do not vote for the death penalty, and improper sentencing of those who lack the mental capacity to understand their crime. All of those things are still fairly regularly happening. That judicial override piece is something that thankfully in Alabama pretty recently ended. And so now judges are not able to overrule a jury, but yet that legal piece was not retroactive. And so there are still dozens of individuals who are on death row in Alabama who are there when a jury voted for them to receive life in prison, and yet a judge overrode that sentence, but the legislation wasn't retroactive. There are lots of groups that are working to engage evangelical Christians and people of all sorts of faiths. I talked about the EJUSA Evangelical Network. There's L'Chaim Jews Against the Death Penalty. There's all sorts of groups that are working to engage lots of faiths and people of no faith. It's going to take engaging all of those groups. But there's an especial piece that we need to note of how the death penalty is supported by especially evangelical Christians. And there's reasons for that. Individuals like Aaron Griffith have captured this in his book, God's Law and Order. Jamar Tisby is an author, historian, and speaker who's captured this story in his book, The Color of Compromise. But they're chronicling how and why is it that Christianity has uniquely, wrongly, very much so wrongly, but how is it that Christianity and the church has supported this? So I want to start moving us towards concluding our time. And I'm hoping that you're hearing that I'm making a lot of cases here, but the overall piece is we know that the death penalty is a failed public policy. At minimum, we're able to say that. And we know that there are more effective responses to violence, ones that address root causes. And so I want to propose a few ways forward for us as we start to wrap up this time. I want us to think about an alternative view, a way of thinking about this, and then an alternative practice, a way that we can think differently, and then a way that we can act and engage differently as we think about all of these things. The alternative view is when we think often about justice, often it's synonymous with punishment. Within Marvel movies, you hear from police officers, within popular culture, within the criminal legal system, all around our culture, we have justice and punishment overlapping. When Batman talks about bringing someone to justice, it's going to cause someone a lot of pain. It's not something that's nice and helpful. I want us to think about justice in a different way. Equal Justice USA and many other organizations that are helping sponsor this event talk about justice not being equated with punishment, but it being equated with safety, with healing, with accountability that repairs. And when we talk about accountability, it's not something that you're forcing someone into. You can't make someone accountable. You can't hold them accountable. You can only offer a space where they are able to move into accountability. And by that, I mean someone, think of the acronym ARC or ARC. True accountability is three things. Someone A, acknowledges what they've done, ways that they've harmed someone. Or they're able to engage in some kind of act of repair that works towards a measure of healing for the person or the individuals that they've harmed. And then the C, some kind of change is made in that person's life or in society so that that person's harm is unlikely to ever happen again. True accountability requires those things, but we see our criminal legal system not making space for actual accountability. It's very difficult to admit what you have done without feeling unsafe or that you're going to be put in prison or executed. It's very rare that there are actual acts of repair that are made of the person trying to serve the person that they've harmed. And it's does not often happen that there are changes systemically, institutionally, societally that work to end the pathway towards that harm that that person was able to make. But that's what true accountability is. So my hope is that we can change our view of this and focus on healing rather than fear-based control. Our criminal legal system is focused on control, and that is a response of fear. Often a lot of what we do is we other individuals and remove them. We put them in prison and think that that actually is what's keeping us safe, forgetting all sorts of things. We're still affected as a society by those individuals. 95% of people who go to prison come out and return to society. So my hope is that our view can shift and we can think when harm, when violence, when crime happens, we don't just think what law was broken and what is it that needs to be the punishment, but what happened, who was harmed, and what healing can we bring about? The practice that I want to point us to, now I referenced all sorts of those earlier, is especially thinking about restorative justice or restorative practices as a whole. How can we pursue actual restoration as a practice when harm happens? And I want to give a nod here, and I'll send you a site that captures a lot of this, to us thinking about how can we build an ecosystem of public safety? What would it look like for us rather than have a public safety system built on fear and on control, but have an ecosystem of public safety that's community-centered, that focuses on trauma, that elevates those who are impacted by violence? What would it look like to build that ecosystem and to build that together within community? So here's what I would call you to do. I'm going to put in the chat, and I'm going to send this in the notes as well, but I really want to make sure that you're able to look at this. There's a list that we have and we want to give you all access to of all sorts of organizations and both state and national organizations that are working in and around and against the death penalty. All those co-sponsoring organizations are some of those, but often each state that still has the death penalty has a state org that's working in and around this issue. Again, I'll send this to you, but I also put it in the chat so that you can see the sheer number of organizations that are working around this issue. And I'd encourage you to find your state and see if you don't know yet, it's all right. See if you can find your state and whether or not it is a state that's able to practice the death penalty, and consider reaching out to that organization at minimum just to learn more about this. There's also national organizations that are listed there. A couple other things before we finish. I'm going to send you, I've mentioned earlier, a follow-up email with detailed notes of all of these things. I'm going to send you a recording on YouTube of this, as well as a Spotify podcast episode in case you just want to listen to this. But I want to close with quoting two individuals. One I referenced earlier, Julius Jones, and another that I haven't mentioned yet. But I want to mention Julius Jones, and I'll put this in the chat so that you can see it, because I really want you to hear his words. He recently wrote an article that was co-published with C.C. Jones Davis in Christianity Today, and he concludes it by saying, "How can we stand for this? Is the death penalty a machine that takes no interest in nuance or new evidence, just death? We must keep working toward a criminal justice system that is truly just." And then lastly, I'm going to point us to Anthony Ray Hinton. And some of you might know his story. He was on death row in Alabama for nearly 30 years for crimes he did not commit. He wrote and published the book, The Sun Does Shine, which was released in 2015. And I want to read you some of his concluding words so you can hear him after he was released, capturing some of the most important themes of what we've talked about here. He says, "We have to find ways to recover after bad things happen. We have to make every ending be a happy ending. Every single one of us wants to matter. We want our lives and our stories and the choices we made or didn't make to matter. Death row taught me that it all matters. How we live matters." So my hope, my desire, my prayer is that you would continue to engage these things with a posture of curiosity. Feel free to reach out to us. Feel free to engage us. We'll send you more information on all of these things. But my hope is to send you out into the world engaged, wondering, and interested. One thing I talk to my kids about with school is that I'm hoping that they approach learning with a sense of wonder and a sense of curiosity. So blessings on your day. Thank you so much for joining us within this time. Again, thank you to our co-sponsoring organizations. And my hope is that you all will continue to engage this and move from a place of awareness into action. Thank you so much.